Imagine for a second that you're like standing on the bank of a river.
Okay.
You've got this tiny little rowboat, right? And you really need to get to the other side. But you have some cargo with you.
Cargo?
Yeah, you are transporting a live wolf, a goat, and a very large head of cabbage.
Right. Okay. The ultimate test of sequential logic.
Exactly.
You've got a spatial constraint there, meaning the boat can really only hold you and like one of those 3 items at a time.
Yeah, and there's a predatory constraint too, because if you leave the wolf on the riverbank alone with the goat, the wolf gets a meal.
Right.
And if you leave the goat alone with the cabbage bowl, the goat gets a meal. So you have to get all 3 across the water completely intact.
Which requires you to basically think multiple steps ahead. Like you take the goat first,
Yeah,
right?
right.
Leaving the wolf and the cabbage behind, can they just ignore each other? Then you row back empty, grab the wolf, take it across.
But you can't just leave the wolf with the goat on that far side.
Exactly. So you have to load the goat back into the boat.
Which feels so counterintuitive.
It does. You row the goat back to the starting bank, you swap it out for the cabbage, row the cabbage across to join the wolf, and then finally go back one last time for the goat.
It's just, it's a puzzle that has frustrated people for centuries. You can actually find variations of it all over the world today. But what most people don't realize is like where we first see it actually written down.
Yeah.
That riddle was popularized and honestly very possibly invented by an 8th century English scholar, a guy from northern England who essentially engineered the entire intellectual framework of medieval Europe.
Which is just going from designing logic puzzles about, farm animals to shaping the destiny of an entire continent. It's a staggering trajectory.
It really is.
And if you want to understand the systems of thought or education or even literally the handwriting that we use in the West today, you have to look at the systems laid down in the late 700s. And almost all of them point back to this one specific individual.
So welcome to our deep dive into the source material. Today we are exploring the life of Alcuin of York. And our mission for you is to trace how a man born into, pretty obscure origins in Northumbria managed to navigate 8th century politics to become the moral and intellectual architect of Charlemagne's empire.
Right, basically sparking what historians call the Carolingian Renaissance.
Yeah.
And to really get it, we need to start by looking at his foundation in Northumbria, which is modern-day northern England back in the 730s.
Right.
The sources indicate his family held what was known as churlish status.
Churlish.
Yeah. So they were free individuals, but they were subordinate to a noble lord. They were essentially commoners. He didn't start out with royal blood. He didn't have vast wealth.
Yet he somehow ends up at the Cathedral School of York during this massive cultural boom. And, okay, let's unpack this. Because I always try to visualize what these ancient institutions were actually doing,
Sure.
Your cathedral school. And I think a lot of us just picture basic religious instruction, just sitting around reading the Bible.
Right.
But looking at the curriculum, York wasn't just a church. It was closer to the Silicon Valley of 8th century Europe, or like an elite modern-day Ivy League university. It was the hub where you went to access the absolute cutting-edge technology of reading, logic, and administration.
That mechanical comparison actually works perfectly, yeah.
Yeah.
Archbishop Egbert was running the church in York at the time. And Egbert had been a student of the Venerable Bede.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so he inherited this deep, really rigorous intellectual tradition. And he was just heavily invested in reforming education. He wanted to raise the baseline competence of the clergy.
Right.
So students at York, they weren't just memorizing scripture, they were mastering the trivium and the quadrivium.
Which we should probably break those down because they basically form the operating system that Alcuin installs across Europe later on. So the trivium, that's the foundation of language, right? Grammar, logic, and rhetoric.
Yeah, think of it as a 3-step process for human thought.
Yeah.
Grammar teaches you the mechanics of language, literally how to structure a sentence so it conveys precise meaning.
Right, the raw code.
Exactly. Then logic teaches you how to ensure the ideas inside those sentences are sound, free of fallacies. And then finally, rhetoric teaches you how to take those sound ideas and communicate them persuasively to other people.
So once you master how to think and communicate with the trivium, then you move on to the quadrivium, which is more about the structure of the physical universe, right? Arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy.
Yeah, and the way they thought about it is so elegant. Arithmetic is just numbers in a vacuum.
Okay.
Geometry is numbers in space. Music is numbers in time. and astronomy is numbers in space and time.
Wow, that's a really cool way to look at it.
It was the absolute pinnacle of Western education at the time, a total unified system for understanding reality. And Egbert built an environment where, merit could actually shine.
Which is how Alcuin thrives.
Right. Alcuin's intellect just flourished there. By the 760s, he's actually running the entire school.
Which actually brings up this strategic career move I noticed in the sources, and I wanted to ask you about it. Because Alcuin becomes the head of this massive intellectual apparatus, but he never actually takes full priestly vows.
Right.
He becomes a deacon, and then he just stops. And if you're a guy climbing the religious ladder in the 8th century, a guy from lower social status, stopping at deacon seems like you're voluntarily capping your own career. Like, why wouldn't he go all the way?
It looks that way, yeah, unless you view it as a very deliberate loophole.
A loophole.
Yeah, because taking full priesthood meant taking on really heavy sacramental and pastoral duties. Performing masses, hearing confessions, managing a local parish day in and day out.
Oh, right. Admin work for the church.
Exactly. And Alcuin, he lived a highly disciplined, monastic-style life for sure, but his primary calling was education. It wasn't pastoral care.
So staying a deacon...
Remaining a deacon basically allowed him to focus entirely on scholarship, teaching, and running the school without getting bogged down in the daily grind of being a parish priest. It just gave him maximum leverage to do what he was best at.
That is so smart. Okay, so he masters this curriculum. He builds this incredible reputation at York. He's the premier educator in England. But then the narrative pivots really sharply.
Yes.
So in 781, the king of Northumbria sends Alcuin on this diplomatic mission down to Rome. He needs to secure official confirmation for the new Archbishop of York. It's just a standard bureaucratic trip.
Right, a quick run to HR, basically.
Yeah, basically. But on his way back home, he's traveling through Parma in modern-day Italy, and he crosses paths with Charlemagne, the king of the Franks. And here's where it gets really interesting.
It's a massive turning point. Charlemagne is in the middle of consolidating this huge, sprawling empire across Western Europe. And he's obviously a brilliant military commander, but he recognizes this fundamental political reality. You cannot hold a fractured, multilingual empire together with just swords. It's impossible. If you want a unified empire, you need a unified bureaucracy. You need administrators and judges and diplomats who all operate on the exact same intellectual wavelength.
Right. He needs that shared operating system we were just talking about.
Exactly.
And Charlemagne clearly knows who Alcuin is. He knows his reputation because he actively recruits him right there in Parma to move to the continent and run the palace school at Aachen. Now, I have to push back a little here because the term palace school usually conjures this image of a glorified finishing school, right?
Yeah,
like
right.
A place where spoiled royal kids learn how to ride horses or use the right fork and maybe sign their own names. But was he really just babysitting noble kids?
No, not at all. What's fascinating here is that Alcuin imports the entire York framework. He overhauls the institution completely.
Wow.
He brings that really rigorous liberal arts curriculum, the trivium and the quadrivium, directly into the Frankish court. So he's teaching grammar and rhetoric and highly complex theology.
To who? Just the kids?
No, his classroom isn't just children. He's teaching the young clerics who are eventually going to run the empire's institutions. He's teaching the royal sons, and he's teaching Charlemagne himself.
Okay, teaching logic and debate to the most powerful warlord in Europe, that sounds like a highly volatile dynamic.
It was incredibly delicate.
I mean, if the king makes a logical fallacy, correcting him seems like a really good way to end up in a dungeon.
Yeah, you don't want to embarrass the guy with the army. But Alcuin diffused that tension by constructing a very specific psychological environment in the school. He actively cultivated this highly personalized, really affectionate community of learning.
How did he do that?
Well, one thing he did was assign classical and biblical nicknames to everyone in his circle. It was a way to flatten the hierarchy and create this sense of an intimate intellectual brotherhood.
Oh, right. So he calls himself Flaccus, after the Roman poet Horace. And he calls Charlemagne David after the biblical king of Israel, which is, I mean, it's almost like they were role-playing a utopian society inside the palace walls.
Yeah.
Like, by using those names, he's framing their daily interactions not as king and servant, right? It's more like they're two philosophers building a new Athens or a new Jerusalem together. It essentially creates an intellectual safe space.
That's exactly it. It allows them to debate ideas on completely neutral ground. But, we have to remember that outside the walls of that classroom, Charlemagne was not acting much like a philosopher at all.
No, not at all.
He was engaged in these brutal, incredibly bloody wars of expansion, particularly against the Saxons. And his policy for dealing with conquered pagans was just merciless.
Yeah, it was forced baptism under threat of execution.
Yeah.
Literally convert to Christianity or die.
Right, and this is where Alcuin's proximity to power translates into massive historical consequence. Because he doesn't just sit back and watch this happen. He pushes back.
Which is wild.
He openly challenges the king of the Franks on this policy.
And I have to say, that is genuinely surprising. It takes an unbelievable amount of nerve for a teacher to walk up to an 8th century warlord, a guy who just conquered half of Europe, and tell him, hey, your military religious strategy is fundamentally wrong. I mean, why would Charlemagne even listen to him?
Well, Alcuin approached it very carefully, through theology. He argued that faith, by its very definition, requires a free act of the human will.
Okay.
So he says, you can force a man into a river for a baptism by holding a sword to his neck, but you cannot force his internal soul to actually believe. Therefore, these forced conversions are not just cruel, they are theologically invalid.
Wow.
But the argument was still incredibly risky because it directly undermined Charlemagne's primary method of pacifying all these conquered territories.
And the sources show this deep complexity in their relationship right here, because Alcuin really loved Charlemagne and he constantly praised his vision, but he was also genuinely terrified of him.
Oh, absolutely.
He knew the king had this ferocious temper and absolute unchecked power. So making this moral stand against executing pagans, it wasn't just a casual philosophical debate over wine. It was Alcuin putting his own life on the line.
And it actually worked. It resulted in real policy change. By 797, Charlemagne abolished the death penalty for paganism.
That's incredible.
It is. Alcuin served as the moral anchor for the empire, but he also served as its theological shield. For example, at the Council of Frankfurt in 794, Alcuin was the primary intellectual force countering the adoptionist movement, which was spreading up from Spain.
Right, and adoptionism, just to clarify for everyone, it claimed that Jesus was born a mere human and was later, adopted by God.
Yeah.
And we might look at that today as just some obscure theological debate, but in the 8th century, theology basically is politics, right?
Oh, 100%. If the nature of Christ is fractured, the entire cosmic order is fractured. Think about it. Charlemagne is claiming a God-given mandate to rule a unified Christian empire. If his subjects can't even agree on the fundamental nature of the God providing that mandate, the political fabric starts to tear. It's a national security threat.
So Alcuin has to fix it.
Yeah, Alcuin completely dismantled the adoptionist arguments, and by doing so, he protected the orthodox foundation that Charlemagne's political legitimacy rested on. He became so utterly indispensable that when Pope Adrian I died, Charlemagne actually commissioned Alcuin to write the epitaph.
No way.
Yeah, it was carved into stone and placed right in St. Peter's Basilica.
So he really reaches the absolute zenith of influence on the continent. I mean, he has the king's ear, he's actively shaping imperial policy, he's defending the church. But simultaneously, while he's at the top of the world, his homeland falls into unprecedented chaos.
Yeah, the contrast is really jarring.
Because in 793, Viking raiders brutally attacked the monastery at Lindisfarne, back in Northumbria.
Right. And Lindisfarne, it wasn't just any monastery. It was a spiritual heartland, a major center of learning. The attack sent shockwaves across the entire Christian world. But for Alcuin, obviously, it was deeply, deeply personal.
Of course.
He wrote this series of letters to English leaders just trying to process the horror of it. And those letters are actually some of the only significant contemporary historical accounts we have of the raid today. He describes the bloodshed on the altars and just the sheer unprecedented terror of the assault.
And for you listening, I mean, imagine the psychological toll that would take. It's like you're stuck working in a foreign capital and you're watching your hometown, the institutions you grew up revering get completely destroyed on the news.
Yeah.
And you are utterly helpless to stop it. He tries to write letters and advise the Northumbrian king on how to respond, maybe trying to find some moral failing that brought this on. But his advice just falls on deaf ears. The political situation in England continues to deteriorate, and Alcuin never actually goes home.
No, he doesn't. And if we connect this to the bigger picture, the trauma of Lindisfarne deeply affected his final act in life. By 796, Alcuin is in his 60s. He finally steps away from the daily pressure of the Aachen court, and Charlemagne makes him the abbot of Marmoutier Abbey in Tours.
Which, on paper, looks like a nice, quiet retirement.
It does look like a retirement, but it actually marks the beginning of his most enduring structural work.
because he oversees these massive projects at Tours that literally reshape European daily life. Like one major initiative was standardizing the Roman rite for the Catholic Mass. Because before this, local customs were just highly fragmented, right? Like a Mass in Gaul looked completely different from a Mass in Rome.
Exactly, and Charlemagne needed cultural cohesion. If his subjects are attending wildly different church services, they still feel like separate, disconnected tribes. So Alcuin took the liturgy straight from Rome, edited it, added some local Gaelic elements to, make it more palatable for the Franks, and created this standardized manual for worship. Suddenly, a priest on one side of the empire and a priest on the other are performing the exact same rituals. They're reading the exact same words.
It created a shared cultural rhythm across thousands of miles.
Yes.
But his biggest project at Tours, and honestly, the one that affects you and me the most today, was the perfection and preservation of a specific style of handwriting, which is called Carolingian minuscule.
Yeah, this is huge. We have to look at how people were actually writing before this happened. Books were copied by hand in all these various messy regional scripts.
Right.
And many of those scripts used only capital letters, with absolutely no spaces between the words, heavily abbreviated. I mean, they were virtually unreadable if you weren't trained in that one specific region's style.
Wow.
As an information technology, it was highly, highly inefficient.
Yeah, I mean, imagine trying to read a whole book with no spaces. If Charlemagne is trying to send written orders across the empire, or if monks are copying the Bible, a regional script means massive translation errors. It's basically like trying to share computer files when everyone in the office is running a different, incompatible operating system.
That is a perfect analogy. Carolingian minuscule solved that completely. It introduced clear, rounded letters. But most importantly, it standardized putting spaces between words.
Thank goodness.
Right. It made reading so much faster and more accurate, especially for people whose native language wasn't Latin. And this script was just pushed out aggressively across the empire's scriptoriums.
And it is the direct ancestor of the lowercase letters we use today. When you read a modern book or, look at a website on your phone, the shape of those lowercase letters traces straight back to Alcuin's monks at Tours.
It's incredible.
And you can really draw a straight line from his trauma over Lindisfarne to this intense obsession with standardizing script. He watched a major center of knowledge just get wiped off the map. He realized physical empires are incredibly fragile. So he essentially engineered a system of mass-producing legible, standardized books to ensure knowledge could actually survive the collapse of the physical world.
Exactly. He was building an infrastructure of memory. And, this brings us to this fascinating tension between public, monumental figure and the private human being, because while he is managing these massive geopolitical cultural projects, he's also just writing a book of logic puzzles on the side.
The river crossing puzzle we started with, the wolf, the goat, and the cabbage, he used these mathematical brain teasers to keep his students' minds sharp.
Yeah.
It just shows this highly playful, deeply engaged intellect.
Yeah, and we see that exact same intense engagement in his personal correspondence, too. Historians have fiercely debated the nature of Alcuin's private letters, particularly the ones he wrote to his male friends and former students.
Right, because there's a lot of debate there.
There is. A scholar named John Boswell, for instance, argued that there is a very strong homoerotic subtext in Alcuin's passionate, deeply emotional language in these letters. But another scholar, Alan Franson, countered that this language actually reflects a very standard medieval Christian concept of friendship, which was known as amicitia.
Right, because the language he uses is incredibly intense by modern standards. He frequently borrows this deeply emotional, romantic imagery from the biblical Song of Songs to express how much he misses his friends or how much he longs to see them. So what does this all mean? How do we even interpret those 8th century relationships today, knowing that their cultural framework was just vastly different from ours?
Well, this raises an important question, right? We have to be incredibly careful about retrofitting modern labels of identity onto medieval emotional expression. The categories that we use to define relationships today, they simply did not exist in the 700s. The concept of amicitia allowed for this spiritual, highly emotive bond between men that really doesn't map cleanly onto modern definitions at all.
Yeah.
But what the debate itself proves, unequivocally, is that Alcuin was a man of profound attachments. He wasn't just some cold, calculating bureaucrat churning out curriculum.
No.
He loved fiercely. His emotional life was every bit as complex and demanding as his intellectual life.
So we've traced an incredible arc today, from a boy of pretty humble status in Northumbria, mastering the trivium at York. Then a chance meeting in Parma pulls him into the orbit of Charlemagne, where he builds a palace school, challenges forced conversions, and defends the empire's entire theology.
Yeah.
He watches his homeland burn from afar and retreats to Tours to standardize the European Mass and essentially invent the lowercase alphabet. He passed away in 804, leaving a fundamentally altered continent behind him.
He essentially coded the software that Western Europe would run on for centuries. Literally from how to argue logically, to how to worship collectively, to how to physically write a sentence.
Which really leaves us with this lingering historical irony to consider. Alcuin dedicated his entire adult life to civilizing Charlemagne's physical empire, right? Trying to build a new Athens for his king. But that political empire violently fractured just a few decades after Alcuin's death.
It did.
The borders collapsed, the swords failed. But you have to wonder if Alcuin, sitting in that abbey at Tours, watching his monks copy manuscripts in that clear lowercase script, if he suspected the truth. That Charlemagne's empire of land wouldn't last, but Alcuin's standardized letters and copied books would become the very vessels that allowed European knowledge to survive the dark centuries that followed.
The kings built the borders, but the teacher built the foundation.
Just like getting the wolf, the goat, and the cabbage across the river, you just have to figure out a system to carry what matters most to the other side.